Weddings are meant to be moments of joy, laughter, and love, a celebration of two souls beginning their journey together. But sometimes, beneath the sparkling lights and flowing gowns, secrets, bitterness, and old wounds come crashing back when least expected. On the day of my ex's wedding, everything seemed perfect until a face from the past stormed in, determined to ruin the ceremony. What happened next was not only shocking but unforgettable. As the crasher's plan backfired in the most humiliating way possible, the morning of the wedding carried a kind of electricity in the air, a blend of nerves and excitement that seemed to echo through every corner of the town. Emma had always imagined her wedding day as something out of a storybook, and now, as the sun painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, it looked like that dream was about to come true. Her house was buzzing with energy. Bridesmaids rushing around, makeup artists carefully working, and family members fussing over the smallest of details. The scent of fresh roses filled the room, their petals scattered on tables and windowsills, symbolizing both beauty and fragility. Emma sat quietly in front of her mirror, her reflection glowing in a way that made even her closest friends stop for a moment and admire her. She looked like the kind of bride who belonged on the cover of a magazine, every detail perfected, from her delicately styled hair to the lace that clung to her gown. Despite the chaos around her, Emma's eyes betrayed a flicker of vulnerability. She had built her life carefully after heartbreak, after the painful memories of the past, and this day was supposed to prove that she had truly moved on. The man waiting at the altar was steady, kind, and everything her ex had failed to be. Yet in the quiet moments between laughter and chatter, Emma found herself listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, fast and unsettled. Perhaps it was the weight of expectation, or perhaps it was a lingering fear that something might go wrong, but she quickly brushed the thought away and forced herself to smile. After all, nothing could spoil this day. Outside, the venue was already filling with guests, their voices weaving into a chorus of excitement. The chandeliers inside the hall sparkled like captured stars, casting a warm glow over tables draped in ivory cloths and decorated with golden accents. Every corner of the space radiated elegance and celebration, but the true centerpiece was Emma herself, hidden away until her grand entrance. The bridesmaids whispered about how breathtaking she looked, and her mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering prayers under her breath. For Emma, it was both comforting and overwhelming, knowing how much this day meant not just to her but to everyone gathered. What no one could see, however, was the shadow lingering in her thoughts. Emma's ex, Nathan, had once promised her forever. He had once looked at her the way her soon-to-be husband looked at her now. But Nathan's lies, his betrayal, and the quiet way he had walked out of her life had left scars that took years to heal. She never expected to see him again, never wanted to. That chapter was closed, locked, and buried deep. Today was about new beginnings, not old wounds. Still, memories have a cruel way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times, and as Emma adjusted her veil, she felt the faint sting of the past brushing against her joy. Her best friend leaned in, squeezing her hand, grounding her back into the moment. "You're going to be amazing," she whispered. Emma smiled, nodding, though her grip tightened as if she needed that reassurance more than she was willing to admit. Beyond the doors of the bridal suite, the music began to play softly, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. The bridesmaids lined up, excitement in their steps, the photographer snapping pictures at every turn. Emma rose slowly, the weight of her gown pressing against her legs, a physical reminder of the gravity of the moment. She glanced once more at her reflection, at the woman who had survived heartbreak, picked herself up, and chosen love again. That was the woman everyone would see today. That was the woman she had fought to become. Each detail of the morning seemed to carry layers of meaning, her bouquet tied with a ribbon her grandmother had given her, the earrings her mother once wore on her wedding day, the smile she forced to hide the tremor in her chest. Everyone around her saw perfection, a radiant bride on the cusp of happiness, but inside her was a storm of emotions she couldn't entirely quiet. Still, she reminded herself, this was the day she had waited for, the day she would walk down the aisle and leave the past behind once and for all. Little did Emma know, while she prepared with delicate precision, someone else was preparing too. Someone who wasn't invited, who didn't belong, and who carried with them the bitterness of secrets not yet revealed. But in this moment, Emma could only focus on the ceremony ahead, convinced that nothing, absolutely nothing, could steal her joy again. The invitation had arrived in a plain white envelope, tucked between bills and advertisements as if it were just another piece of mail. But the moment I saw Emma's name scripted in elegant gold across the front, my chest tightened. It had been years since we had spoken, years since our lives had split into different directions, yet now here was a reminder of the past that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I held the card carefully, reading every word twice, the date and venue burning into my mind. An invitation to her wedding, a gesture I couldn't decide was an act of peace or a cruel test of how much I had really moved on. For hours I sat staring at it, the memories of Emma flooding back uninvited. I remembered the laughter we once shared, the promises we once whispered, and the storm that tore it all apart. I had convinced myself that I was fine, that I didn't care anymore, but holding that card reminded me just how fragile those walls of indifference really were. The question gnawed at me, why would she want me there? Did she want to prove she had moved on without me? Did she hope I would sit among the crowd, forced to watch her build the future we had once planned together? I debated throwing it away, pretending I had never seen it. No one would blame me for ignoring it. But something about the boldness of the gesture, her choosing to include me, lit a fire in my chest. Part of me wanted to see her, to measure the life she had built against the ruins of what we had once shared. Another part of me felt the pull of unfinished business, like a thread left hanging loose in the fabric of our story. Attending meant facing emotions I had buried, but it also meant finding answers to questions I had avoided for too long. When the day of the wedding finally came, the weight of that decision pressed down on me harder than I expected. I stood outside the grand hall, the hum of laughter and music spilling through the doors, and wondered if I was walking into a celebration or a trap of my own making. The sight of familiar faces made me stiffen, people who remembered the days when Emma and I were inseparable, people who now looked at me with curiosity, perhaps even pity. Some greeted me politely, though their eyes lingered a little too long, silently questioning why I had come. The hall itself was breathtaking, draped in flowers and glowing with candlelight, the kind of place that seemed to belong more to a dream than reality. Couples leaned close to one another, whispering, while family members exchanged stories and laughter. Everywhere I looked, joy radiated from the walls, as though the very air had been crafted to remind me of what was no longer mine. I took a seat near the back, wanting to disappear into the crowd, but still close enough to see the moment she walked down the aisle. My pulse raced as if I were the one waiting for her at the altar, not the man she had chosen. I couldn't shake the tension wrapping itself around me. Every detail of the ceremony carried a subtle sting, the music that reminded me of nights we once danced together, the flowers she used to say were her favorite, even the way her family smiled, as though their hearts had finally found peace in a future where I didn't exist. I sat still, forcing myself to breathe, telling myself over and over that I had made the right choice by coming. But as I scanned the room, I noticed something strange. Whispers carried between groups of guests, uneasy glances shot toward the doors, and an undercurrent of nervous energy seemed to ripple through the room. It wasn't just me feeling the weight of the moment, there was something else brewing, something no one could quite put into words. The invitation I had once thought was a simple gesture now felt like the opening move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. The ceremony hadn't even begun, and yet a part of me sensed that this wedding would be nothing like the carefully scripted fairy tale Emma had planned. The hall grew quieter as the music shifted to a softer tune, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests shuffled in their seats, voices lowered to murmurs, as though they, too, could feel the strange tension hanging in the air. It wasn't the usual wedding day jitters, this felt different, heavier, like the kind of silence before a storm. I tried to convince myself it was just my own nerves amplifying everything, but the way people kept glancing toward the doors, the way conversations trailed off into unfinished sentences, told me I wasn't the only one who sensed it. I sat stiffly in my chair, my hands resting on my knees, scanning the room without meaning to. Every familiar face tugged at a memory I had long tried to bury. There was Emma's aunt, the one who once told me she thought I'd be part of the family forever. There was her cousin, who never quite trusted me, whispering something now that made her mother frown. Everywhere, people carried a kind of quiet unease, masking it with forced smiles. And yet, despite the uneasiness, the stage was set for perfection, candles glowing steadily, the altar shining beneath the soft lights, the fragrance of roses and lilies filling the room. When Emma finally appeared at the far end of the aisle, a hush fell over the hall, all whispers swallowed in an instant. She looked radiant, her gown shimmering faintly with every step, the veil cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of light. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, locked on the man waiting for her, but I noticed the way her fingers trembled around the bouquet she held. The crowd gasped at her beauty, yet I couldn't help but wonder if they noticed the flicker of tension behind her smile. It was subtle, but it was there, a guardedness, as if she were bracing herself for something. The groom, Daniel, stood at the altar with the kind of steady confidence that only deep love could give. His face lit up at the sight of Emma, his entire body seeming to exhale with relief, as though seeing her walking toward him confirmed that his life was truly about to begin. He looked proud, protective, ready to promise her the kind of devotion I had once failed to give. Watching them was painful, but there was no bitterness in Daniel's gaze, only adoration. It should have been enough to calm the uneasiness inside me, but instead it only made me more restless. As Emma made her way closer, the whispers began again, soft, urgent, impossible to ignore. A man behind me muttered something I couldn't quite hear, and a woman to my left pressed her lips tightly together, her gaze darting toward the side entrance of the hall. It was as if the guests knew something Emma didn't, or perhaps they were waiting for something to happen. My heartbeat quickened, a gnawing instinct telling me this wasn't the nervous anticipation of a bride's arrival but the quiet dread of an audience bracing for a scene. Emma reached the altar, her father placing her hand in Daniel's before stepping back with misty eyes. The officiant began to speak, his voice warm and steady, welcoming everyone, weaving words of love and new beginnings. But as his words carried through the room, my focus kept slipping, my eyes darting toward the doors, expecting them to burst open at any second. My chest tightened with a mix of dread and curiosity, though I couldn't say why. Perhaps it was because I knew Emma's past as well as anyone, knew that stories don't always end as cleanly as we pretend they do. Then it happened. A sound from the back, a loud thud, like a chair scraping against the floor. Heads turned, gasps rippled, and the officiant's voice faltered for the briefest moment. Emma froze, her eyes flicking toward the sound, though she quickly forced her attention back on Daniel. Daniel's hand squeezed hers gently, steadying her, silently promising that nothing would ruin this day. But the whispers grew louder now, waves of unease passing through the crowd, until the tension in the air became almost unbearable. I leaned forward slightly, my pulse pounding, as the doors creaked open. The moment stretched painfully long, every second thick with suspense. Though no one had entered yet, the energy in the room shifted instantly, the joyful warmth replaced by something sharp, uneasy, like the first cold wind before a storm breaks. Emma's shoulders stiffened, and her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so quick most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did. She knew. Somehow, she knew what was coming. The officiant cleared his throat, trying to continue, but the weight of expectation pressed down on everyone. A wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love, a safe place filled with joy and laughter. Instead, this ceremony already felt like the stage for a confrontation waiting to happen. All that remained was for the storm to step through those doors. The moment the vows were about to begin, the tension in the hall grew unbearable. The officiant's voice was steady, but every pause between his words seemed to stretch longer than it should, as though even he felt the shift in the room. Emma and Daniel stood together, hands clasped, but her knuckles had turned white from how tightly she gripped the bouquet. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes darting toward the back doors more often than toward the couple standing at the altar. A wedding is supposed to be filled with joy, but here, joy seemed to tremble on fragile ground, threatened by something just outside. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. The heavy wooden doors at the end of the aisle slammed open, crashing against the walls with a force that made the chandeliers above quiver. Gasps filled the hall like a wave, people twisting in their seats, some even rising in shock. The officiant's voice died instantly, his open mouth frozen mid-sentence, and the music that had softly played in the background stopped on a sharp, awkward note. There, framed in the doorway, stood a figure none of us expected to see. The wedding crasher. Their chest heaved with the weight of unspoken words, their eyes locked on Emma like a predator finally spotting prey. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent again, stunned into stillness, every guest caught between disbelief and curiosity. The image of the perfect wedding had shattered in an instant, replaced by the sharp edge of chaos. Emma's face drained of color, her lips parting in a soft gasp. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the figure who had intruded on the most important moment of her life. Daniel's jaw clenched as he instinctively stepped closer to her, his arm subtly shifting to shield her from the sudden intrusion. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with the promise of confrontation if necessary. It was clear he wouldn't let anyone ruin this day without a fight. The guests were restless now, whispers spreading like wildfire across the hall. Some clutched at their pearls and ties, scandalized, while others leaned forward eagerly, hungry for the drama unfolding in front of them. The crasher took slow, deliberate steps down the aisle, their shoes echoing against the marble floor with each heavy stride. The sound was almost mocking, as if daring anyone to stop them. Every step forward felt like a wound slicing into the fragile beauty of the day. Emma's shoulders trembled, her grip on Daniel tightening until her bouquet shook. She wanted to say something, anything, to end the nightmare, but her voice seemed stolen by fear, by the shock of seeing a face she had hoped never to see again. Memories flickered in her eyes, the past surging to the surface no matter how hard she had buried it. The officiant, struggling to regain control, cleared his throat and raised a hand. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private ceremony. You need to." But his words were drowned out by the crasher's sudden voice, sharp and cutting, echoing through the silent hall. "Stop this wedding right now." The hall erupted in chaos. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few screams filled the space. The demand hung in the air, heavy and shocking, shaking the fragile piece to its core. Emma's eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat, and Daniel instinctively took a firmer stance beside her. The officiant looked lost, as though his script had been torn from his hands, leaving him powerless to control what was spiraling out of hand. The crasher pointed directly at Emma, their voice rising. "You can't marry him. Not after everything you've done." The accusation struck the crowd like lightning. Guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Emma, the crasher, and Daniel. Whispers turned into open conversations, shock rippling in every direction. Emma's face flushed, her lips trembling as if to speak, but no words came out. She stood frozen, her secrets teetering dangerously close to the edge of exposure. Daniel, however, didn't flinch. His arm slid protectively in front of Emma, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice steady, commanding the room's attention. But even his confidence couldn't erase the damage. The perfect image of a fairy tale wedding had been torn apart, and every guest was now watching with wide, hungry eyes, waiting to see the truth that was about to be dragged into the open. The crasher smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from knowing they held the power in that moment. They took another step closer, eyes gleaming with something dark, almost triumphant. The wedding had stopped, the silence of suspense pressing on every chest in the room. And as Emma finally lifted her chin, her trembling hidden beneath forced composure, the crowd could sense that what came next would change everything. The weight of the moment was unbearable, every eye in the hall glued to the figure standing defiantly in the middle of the aisle. The crasher's words still hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, choking the joy out of the room. Emma stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. Daniel's arm was a protective barrier in front of her, but even his steady presence couldn't mask the way her entire body seemed to quake under the force of the accusation. "Not after everything you've done," the crasher repeated, their voice louder now, each word sharp enough to slice through the silence. Gasps erupted again from the crowd, followed by hurried whispers that spread like wildfire. The guests shifted uneasily, some leaning forward in their seats as if the scandal were a performance they couldn't look away from, others hiding their shock behind hands and lowered gazes. It was as though the entire room had transformed from witnesses of a wedding into jurors of a trial. The officiant tried once more to intervene, his voice unsteady but determined. "Sir, please, you cannot." The crasher cut him off without hesitation, their gaze fixed squarely on Emma. "She doesn't deserve this. She doesn't deserve him. You all think she's perfect, but you don't know the truth. You don't know what she's hiding." Emma flinched, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came out. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her breathing shallow, the words trapped in her throat. Daniel leaned closer to her, his voice low but firm. "Emma, don't listen to this. It's just noise." His hand squeezed hers, grounding her, yet she didn't squeeze back. Her fingers remained stiff, frozen in place, as though she wasn't entirely sure how much of what was being said might unravel her carefully built new life. The crasher continued forward, each step echoing against the marble floor, each stride a declaration of defiance. "You can stand here in your white dress, play the role of the perfect bride, but I know the truth about you, Emma. I know what you did, and so should everyone else." The words struck like a hammer. A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall, faces turning to Emma, searching her expression for cracks, for evidence that the accusation wasn't entirely baseless. Some eyes narrowed in suspicion, others widened in pity, but all of them focused on her. Emma's chest tightened under the weight of their stares. She felt exposed, as though the lace gown and flowing veil that once made her feel untouchable had now become a spotlight revealing her vulnerability. Daniel, unwilling to let the crasher dominate the room any longer, stepped forward, his voice booming with authority. "That's enough. You have no right to be here. Whatever you think you know, this is not the time, and it's certainly not the place." His tone was calm but edged with steel, commanding the kind of respect that made several guests nod in silent agreement. But the crasher didn't falter. If anything, Daniel's firmness only seemed to fuel their fire. "This is exactly the time," the crasher shot back, their eyes narrowing. "You're about to vow your life to her. Don't you think you deserve to know who she really is? Don't you all deserve to know?" The hall fell into an uneasy silence, the crowd holding its collective breath. Emma's hands shook violently now, the bouquet slipping slightly, petals trembling loose and falling to the floor. She wanted to scream, to deny, to shut down the chaos before it spread further, but the fear of what might come next paralyzed her. She could already see her carefully built facade unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of a truth she thought would never resurface. Her eyes met the crasher's for the briefest moment, and in that instant, everyone in the room saw something flicker across her face. It wasn't anger, nor was it outright denial, it was fear. That single flash of emotion was enough to deepen the whispers in the crowd, enough to make suspicion dig its claws deeper. The crasher stopped just a few feet away from the altar, standing tall and unyielding, their presence dominating the space. "Tell him, Emma," they demanded, their voice trembling with intensity. "Tell him what you've done, or I will." Emma's lips trembled, her eyes darting between Daniel, the crasher, and the guests who were now staring at her with piercing judgment. Her throat tightened as if every word she wanted to say was locked away by the fear of losing everything she had fought for. Daniel turned to her, his eyes searching hers, steady but quietly demanding. "Emma, is there something I need to know?" The question lingered in the air like a blade poised to strike, the room so quiet that even the faintest breath felt deafening. The fairy tale had shattered completely, and now all that remained was the raw, unyielding suspense of truth teetering on the edge of revelation. The silence that followed Daniel's question stretched across the hall like a taut rope, ready to snap at any second. Emma's lips quivered, her eyes wide and glassy, caught between fight and flight. She clutched her bouquet so tightly that the stems bent beneath her fingers, and petals fell one by one onto the marble floor like the pieces of her composure. The crasher stood firm, arms folded, their eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction that made the tension even more unbearable. The room wasn't just waiting anymore, it was judging. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, their whispers no longer hushed but audible, rippling from one row to the next. "What do they mean?" a woman near the front asked in a trembling voice. A man 2 rows back leaned toward his companion, his words sharp, "There must be something. Look at her face, she isn't denying it." Others tried to shush the murmurs, but the damage was done. Curiosity had transformed into suspicion, and suspicion into doubt. The atmosphere inside the hall changed drastically. Where once there had been admiration and love directed at the bride, there was now unease, a collective questioning that grew heavier by the second. Emma could feel it pressing on her like invisible hands, every stare piercing through her gown, her veil, her very skin. She was no longer the flawless bride everyone celebrated, she was now the center of scandal, the subject of rumor, the woman with secrets that threatened to poison the purity of her big day. Her mother, sitting in the second row, lifted a trembling hand to her mouth, her face pale. Emma's father sat rigidly beside her, his jaw set in stone, his eyes dark with something between shame and anger. Even her bridesmaids, who had minutes ago been glowing with excitement, now exchanged nervous glances, as though silently asking each other whether they had been complicit in hiding something. The people who had come to celebrate her union were turning into an audience of skeptics, each one demanding answers without speaking them aloud. Daniel's grip on her hand tightened. His voice was lower this time, softer, but heavy with meaning. "Emma," he whispered, "say something. Tell me this isn't true." But Emma's throat closed around the words she wanted to say. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, her silence only making the whispers louder, the suspicion sharper. Every second she remained quiet was an admission in the eyes of those watching. She knew it, felt it, and yet she couldn't bring herself to form the words. The crasher seized the moment, their voice cutting through the room like a knife. "See? She can't even deny it. You all think she's pure, that she deserves this fairy tale wedding, but the truth is, she's been lying to every single one of you." Their words rang with venom, feeding the unease, stoking the flames of doubt until it burned hot and uncontrollable. Gasps spread through the crowd, some guests shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding slowly as if connecting invisible dots that might not even exist. Suspicion has a way of rewriting memories, of bending facts to fit the narrative it wants to believe, and in that hall, every shared look, every hesitant smile of Emma's in the past became fuel for the guests' growing distrust. Emma's vision blurred with unshed tears, her chest tightening until she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were wrong, but she also knew the crasher held something dangerous, that could destroy her if revealed. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was fear of a truth too sharp to face. But no one else in the room could see that. To them, her silence was guilt. The officiant tried again to restore order, his voice shaking as he raised his hands. "Please, everyone, let us remember why we are here today." But his words were drowned by the thunder of suspicion rolling through the hall. Guests leaned over to whisper furiously, their eyes flicking back to Emma, no longer filled with admiration but with doubt, even disdain. The dreamlike atmosphere had curdled into something ugly, a trial by public opinion where the bride stood accused and defenseless. Emma's cheeks burned with humiliation, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the whole room could hear it. She could feel her carefully crafted image collapsing, her fairy tale unraveling thread by thread as suspicion consumed the very people who had come to celebrate her happiness. And standing in the middle of it all, the crasher smiled faintly, knowing they had shifted the tide. The crowd was no longer on Emma's side, they were watching, waiting, ready to turn against her completely the moment the next revelation fell. The whispers had grown into a restless murmur, a low storm of voices filling the hall, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the pounding in Emma's ears. Her hands shook so violently that the bouquet slipped from her grip, scattering across the polished marble floor in a slow cascade of white petals. A gasp rose from the guests at the sight, as though the fallen flowers themselves were proof of guilt. Emma bent as if to retrieve them, then froze, realizing that no gesture of grace could repair the cracks forming all around her. The crasher took another step forward, closer now, their presence dominating the space like a shadow swallowing light. Their voice dropped lower, quieter, but sharper than before, slicing through the hall with an intimacy that made every guest lean in to listen. You all deserve to know why I'm here. Why she doesn't deserve this man standing beside her. Their eyes flicked toward Daniel, steady and piercing, before returning to Emma. Because she built this day on lies. Lies she thought would stay buried. The crowd shifted again, their faces a mixture of hunger and horror. Suspicion alone was powerful, but the promise of hidden truths was irresistible. Guests who had known Emma since childhood stared at her as if they had never really seen her before. Friends she trusted leaned closer to one another, whispering urgently, dissecting every detail of her behavior. Her mother shook her head slowly, disbelief etched deep in her features, while her father's jaw tightened with every passing second, anger simmering beneath the surface. Emma's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her lips parted, desperate to respond, but still nothing came. Her silence had already been interpreted as guilt, now it risked becoming confirmation. Her eyes darted toward Daniel, pleading silently for him to understand, to believe in her even if no one else did. But Daniel's face was unreadable, a storm of emotions flickering across it. Confusion, fear, and an ache for the truth. The crasher's voice grew bolder, feeding on the energy of the room. You think she's some innocent bride? Ask her what she did before this wedding was even planned. Ask her who she betrayed. Ask her who she hurt. Gasps spread like wildfire, the words igniting the tension into flames of outrage. Several guests rose halfway from their seats, their curiosity outweighing their politeness. The officiant looked helpless, caught between his duty to protect the sanctity of the ceremony and the chaos unraveling in front of him. The chandeliers above swayed faintly, their crystals scattering fractured light across faces twisted in shock, suspicion, and, for some, delight at the unfolding scandal. Emma's hands clenched tightly at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream, to shut the crasher up before their poison spread further, but the truth was too heavy on her tongue. There were things she had never told Daniel, things she thought she had locked away forever. She had prayed they would never come to light, least of all in this moment, in front of everyone she loved. Yet here it was, rising from the shadows to tear her world apart. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice strong but shaking at the edges. Enough games. If you've come here with something to say, then say it. Stop speaking in riddles. His eyes locked onto the crasher, steel beneath the uncertainty. If you have proof, then show it. If not, leave this hall right now. The crasher's lips curled into a small, victorious smile, as though this was the invitation they had been waiting for. They reached into their pocket, pulling out a folded stack of papers, their hand trembling not with fear but with anticipation. Oh, I have proof, they said, their voice carrying easily across the silent hall. And once you all hear it, you'll understand exactly why I couldn't let this wedding go on. Emma's stomach dropped, her knees weakening until she thought she might collapse right there at the altar. Her vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back, her entire body screaming to run, to flee from the humiliation that was about to descend. But there was no escape, not with every guest's eyes pinned to her, not with the crasher's words tightening the noose of suspicion around her neck. The hall felt smaller, suffocating, the air thick with dread. Every heartbeat echoed louder, every breath shallower, as the stage shifted from a joyous wedding into a public reckoning. Whatever was hidden was about to be dragged into the light, and Emma knew there would be no turning back. And as the crasher unfolded the papers slowly, deliberately, savoring the suspense. The entire hall leaned in, breathless, waiting for the secrets that would change everything. Emma's breath came fast and shallow, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out even the murmurs of the crowd. The crasher held the papers high, waving them like a trophy, letting the silence stretch before they finally spoke again. Here it is. Proof that your perfect bride isn't the angel she pretends to be. Their words dripped with venom, and the crowd leaned forward as though they were at the climax of a play. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking down, instead of running from the shame, Emma straightened her spine. Her trembling stilled, her tears dried, and a fire rose in her chest that even she hadn't known she possessed. She looked at Daniel, who was frozen between faith and doubt, and she realized she had a choice. She could allow this stranger to rewrite her story, or she could seize control of it and shatter their performance once and for all. "Give me those," Emma said suddenly, her voice sharp, commanding. It was the first time she'd spoken since the interruption, and the authority in her tone startled the entire room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she strode forward, every step steady and deliberate. The crasher faltered for just a second, their confidence flickering as Emma's hand snatched the stack of papers from their grip. She unfolded the sheets, her eyes scanning quickly, then lifted them high so everyone could see. "These," she announced, "are forgeries. Lies dressed up as truth." Her voice carried clearly through the hall, reaching even the furthest row. "And I have the real evidence to prove it." Daniel's eyes widened, confusion warring with hope, while the crowd erupted with restless whispers. The crasher sneered, trying to recover their bravado. "That's what they all say when they're caught. Deny, deny, deny." Emma didn't flinch. She reached for her maid of honor, Sarah, who hurried forward with a folder Emma had tucked away weeks ago, just in case. She hadn't expected to use it today, but something in her had told her to keep it close. She pulled out photographs, messages, and official letters, each piece carefully preserved and undeniably authentic. "This," Emma declared, holding up the first letter, "is from my former employer. It proves the exact opposite of what these papers claim. I was never fired for dishonesty, I left on my own terms, and here's the signed resignation letter to prove it." Gasps rippled through the guests, several leaning in closer to see the bold, black ink of the signature. "And these," she continued, fanning out a series of emails projected onto the screen behind the altar, "show exactly who has been harassing me for months. The same person standing right here, pretending to expose me." The audience twisted in their seats, faces turning toward the crasher, eyes narrowing with suspicion. The crasher's smug expression wavered, their lips parting but no words coming. Emma pressed on, her voice unwavering now, her anger fueling every syllable. "You forged these lies to make me look guilty, to tear me down in front of everyone I love. But you forgot one thing. Truth leaves a trail, and I kept every single piece of it." Sarah stepped forward again, handing Emma a final document, and Emma's hand trembled, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of triumph, as she held it aloft. "And here," she said, her tone like a final blow, "is proof from a private investigator I hired weeks ago, after your threats first began. Every message traced back to your phone. Every lie tied directly to your name." A stunned silence filled the hall, thick and heavy. Then the murmurs began, not against Emma this time, but against the crasher. Friends who had once looked at Emma with suspicion now turned their narrowed gazes onto the intruder, disgust and betrayal etched across their faces. Daniel took a step forward, his jaw tightening, his eyes locked onto the crasher with fury. So this entire stunt was nothing but revenge? Nothing but a performance to humiliate her? His voice thundered through the hall, louder than the crasher's had ever been. Emma's chest heaved, her eyes burning, but not from shame this time, from the release of everything she had held back. The crasher had tried to strip her dignity away, but instead, she stood taller than ever, her truth undeniable, her strength laid bare before all. The silence that followed wasn't the quiet of suspicion anymore, it was the calm before humiliation struck, not for Emma, but for the one who had tried to destroy her. The hall was so silent it felt like even the chandeliers had stopped swaying, as if the very air itself held its breath. All eyes were fixed on the crasher, the once confident figure now trembling in the center of the room, stripped of their smugness and exposed under the weight of undeniable truth. For a moment, they tried to salvage their dignity, their lips twitching as though searching for a clever retort, but every word died before it could leave their mouth. Emma stood tall at the altar, the stack of genuine evidence clutched tightly in her hand. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the tension like a blade. "You came here to humiliate me," she said, her tone cold, steady, "but all you've done is reveal yourself for who you truly are, a liar, a manipulator, and a coward." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality, and every guest felt the sting of them. The crowd, restless moments ago, now turned into a unified force of judgment. Murmurs rose, harsh and biting, directed not at Emma but at the crasher. Old friends who had gasped at Emma's silence now whispered venom about the intruder. Strangers who had leaned forward in curiosity now recoiled in disgust. The crasher's shoulders hunched under the invisible weight of 100 condemning stares. Emma's maid of honor, Sarah, stepped forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. "How dare you come here, on her wedding day, and try to destroy her happiness with lies? Do you know what kind of person that makes you?" She didn't wait for an answer. The silence that followed was louder than any reply could have been. Daniel finally moved, his presence commanding the room as he walked across the aisle toward the crasher. His jaw was set, his eyes blazing with a fury none of the guests had ever seen before. He stopped just inches away, his voice low but carrying like thunder. "You almost succeeded in ruining the most important day of my life. You tried to poison everything with your bitterness. But instead, you've made us stronger. And I will never forget this attempt to break us." The crasher's face flushed a deep, mottled red, their hands twitching as though itching to flee but paralyzed by the hostile energy of the crowd. Several guests stood up now, openly voicing their disdain. One older relative sneered, "Shameful. To stoop so low, in front of everyone." Another hissed, "Disgusting. You should be ashamed to even show your face." The words rained down, harsher than any physical blow, and the crasher flinched with each one. Emma didn't move to comfort them, didn't offer them a shred of kindness. This wasn't a moment for forgiveness, it was a reckoning. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and stood close enough that the crasher had no choice but to meet her eyes. Her voice dropped, low and steady, meant only for them but loud enough for the room to hear. "You thought this day would break me. But it's you who's broken now. Every person in this room will remember this moment, not as my humiliation, but as yours." The crasher's eyes darted desperately toward the exit, searching for escape, but the weight of the stairs kept them rooted in place, exposed like a villain at the end of a play. Their lips parted in one last attempt to speak, but the words came out strangled, incoherent, drowned by the sudden swell of voices from the crowd. "Leave." The word came from Daniel, sharp and absolute. "Get out of this hall. Now." The command struck like a whip, and finally the crasher moved, stumbling backward, their bravado shattered, their face pale and slick with sweat. Guests parted like the sea, but not out of respect, out of disgust, as though the very act of brushing against them would taint their clothes. Every step toward the door was punctuated by whispers, harsh laughter, and pointed stares. Someone snickered, another scoffed, and one bold voice called out, "That's what happens when you play with fire." By the time the crasher reached the grand doors, they were shaking, their once confident stride reduced to a pitiful shuffle. They glanced back one final time, but the sight that greeted them was unbearable. Emma, radiant and unbroken, standing tall at the altar with Daniel at her side, their hands clasped tightly together, surrounded by guests who now looked at her with admiration and respect. The doors slammed shut behind the crasher, the sound echoing like a final judgment. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly, the heavy tension replaced with relief, applause even, as guests turned their voices not toward scandal but toward celebration. Emma let out a shaky breath, Daniel pulling her close, his forehead resting against hers as the crowd erupted in support. The wedding, once hijacked by lies, had been reclaimed with truth. And the one who came to shame had left with their own humiliation branded into them, a scar they would carry long after the music resumed and the vows were spoken. Emma didn't smile out of triumph, she didn't need to. Her strength had spoken for itself, and in the end, the crasher had given her something unexpected, the chance to prove to everyone, including herself, that no amount of lies could ever steal her dignity.